Ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to this plenary session on decarbonisation and future growth, how to change our mobility system and remain competitive. My name is Jackie Davis. I will have the privilege of moderating our discussions this morning, and we want to have a very interactive, a very lively debate on this central issue. So I'll be coming amongst you later on with the microphone for your questions and your comments. Please do contribute to the debate. Transport Commissioner Violeta Bulc said in her opening speech to TRA 2018, decarbonisation is a core enabler for the future of European transport. One of the ways of squaring that circle, if you like, curbing emissions without curbing mobility and economic growth. The Director General, Henrik Hololei, also said on the opening day, future mobility must be decarbonised mobility. And many argue that this is the major challenge for our transport system now and in the years to come, in order to both deliver sustainable mobility itself and contribute to those wider EU and international goals in relation to climate change and so on. As I said earlier, we do want this to be a very interactive day, but we also wanted to give you some inspiration for that discussion. So before I introduce our panel to launch the debate, we are going to have a context-setting keynote speech. And for that, I am delighted to welcome to the stage Dr. Gerd Schuster, Senior Vice President, Research, New Technologies and Innovations at BMW, to talk to us about Towards Sustainability on European Roads. Dr. Schuster, great to have you with us, and over to you, sir.
Jackie, thank you very much. I don't know if I will be inspiring, but at least I will give some input for the discussion. I'm here today with two hats, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, the BMW research hat, and the other, UCAR chairperson 2018 is an honor to be for me. In the case you do not know UCAR exactly, UCAR represents the research departments of the automotive industry in Europe, which includes, of course, the commercial vehicles. Let's begin with some statements from the BMW side. We are deeply convinced that the integration of environmental, social, and economic aspects in business decisions is necessary for long-term success. These three aspects, known as people, planet, profit, have to be covered simultaneously. To the first one, meeting environmental regulations, I think, is self-evident. And innovations in decarbonization are a big chance for future economic growth. We could export, will export this technology in our cars, in our trucks also, to US and to Asia. Secondly, we as a company are a responsible part of society. And it's not only about that we care about our customers and the employees, the many people employed in our industry. But we also have to consider the interests of those people who do not drive cars and are affected directly or indirectly by road mobility. To make this clear, livable city should not only be dominated by cars. Also, car people like green spaces in inner cities, no doubt. On the other hand, personally, I would expect that cars are not blamed for all environmental evil. Coming to solutions, of course, in each city we need a strong public transport as basis for mobility. And secondly, as BMW, and I think also I can speak for the industry, we support also multiple forms of mobility, flexible mobility, individual mobility, mobility services. These services will also be a big part of the solution for the future. But now I would like to go more in detail regarding the very direct contributors to decarbonization, our powertrains. You see here the most important technologies. You all know them. Beginning with the right side, the combustion engine will have a long-term future. I will come back to that later. Secondly, fuel cells are also important. We developed together with our partner Toyota fuel cell technology of the future. We work on performance, we work on reducing costs. We will build a small series of cars in 2022. This technology is important, but this technology is far not as urgent as the EV technology. While the 2030s could become to the decade of the fuel cells, the 2020s clearly belong to EVs and to PHEVs. I'm often asked, do we need both EVs and PHEVs? Do we need both long-term? Well, to discuss that, first we have to consider that not only EVs but also PHEVs will have an increased electric range in future. That means that they will drive in cities fully emission-free. And because we know that, the customers will have in future the decision. If he needs a car which travels in urban areas predominantly, then perhaps the EV is the best choice. If the customer needs a car which he wants to travel with during the week, emission-free commuting, and wants to have the freedom to drive anytime, anywhere, in holidays, on weekend trips, the PHEV is a very interesting offer. Remember, PHEVs will have a longer electric range than today. You will cover a lot of the mileage, of the yearly mileage you have with such a car. So both are important, EVs and PHEVs, and later on, fuel cell vehicles. I'm happy to see that in this chart, coming from AirTruck, this is a sign of collaboration. I use also charts from other organizations. The colleagues, the multi-stakeholder colleagues, are working on how can the electric driving within cities can be guaranteed or even enforced. I think this is a good approach because it really helps getting cities emission-free with EVs and PHEVs. Now I would like to put on my UCAR hat, and in this role, the position of the commercial vehicles is also integrated. Earlier this year, we had some workshops and thought about, do we have a common position, some common conclusions, how the powertrains of the future will look like? And these are the relevant results. Firstly, it's very clear, our powertrains will turn towards zero emission. The direction is clear. But it's also clear there will be a variety of different powertrains, a lot of technologies, and the customer will decide which is the most important one. It's also clear that with these technologies, the goals of the Paris Climate Conference can be met and will be met. So direction is good. Secondly, and I think with the last charts I already explained it, passenger cars, delivery trucks and buses will drive emission-free in urban areas as EVs and as PHEVs. Thirdly, passenger cars for long-distance travel and long-haul commercial vehicles will predominantly be powered by hybrid powertrains, plug-in hybrid powertrains, and advanced ICEs. Why will this be the case? The one reason is the independency from electric charging, but that's not the main thing. The main thing is that the energy density in fuels, fossil fuels, and in future also synfuels is much higher as in batteries, also than in future batteries. So there is a lot of reason that the long-haul commercial vehicles and long-distance travel with passenger cars will be powered by powertrains, which also include a combustion engine. And the combustion engines, they will be cleaner than today, and this will be also a part of the solution. So the fourth point, the internal combustion engine has its future and gets, I think in the 2030s, even more interesting if it's combined with synfuels. We have to work on affordable synfuels, so we have this also as one part of the solution. And of course, as a wish and as a need, the more renewable electricity is the basis for these powertrains, the more sense it makes that we switch these powertrains towards zero emission locally. Sorry. No. So, ladies and gentlemen, these have been some powertrain statements from UCAR, and I think they are useful because they give directions. There is not only one direction. It's not so simple. It's differentiated, but that is how it is. And we, as UCAR, are clearly committed to strongly efforts to reduce CO2 and pollutant emissions. And of course, also it's clear that we fight for the competitiveness of our industry. We are employing currently more than 10 million people in Europe, including the suppliers, and we fight that this can be guaranteed long term. So everything is fine with decarbonization and electric vehicles? No, it is not. I have big concerns, this can also be discussed later in the discussion, about the charging infrastructure. We as BMW already announced that we bring 25 PHEVs and EVs until 25, so this is official. And of course, we will not be the only ones. There will be a high number of PHEVs and EVs in the market until 25. It's sure there will be more, much more than 100 models. It could be more than 200 or even 300 different models. So for the customers, a lot of interesting offers to buy or to lease or to use in the form of car sharing. Will the customers be prepared? It's only 7 years. It's only 7 years. And if we look closer, what are the doubts of BEV owners or potential EV buyers? Range and charging are the main issues. That's well known. The range is one thing. This will be covered and solved by industry. The charging topic cannot be solved by the car industry when electrification goes into high volume. It cannot be solved. What's the setup we really need altogether to have decarbonization coming true? We need a lot of convenient charging possibilities. On the one hand, public charging is important. It's somehow the basics in a city, and it shows that a city takes electromobility serious. On the other hand, when you go into volume, we need a lot of charging points at home, at work. These many charging points do not need to be high performance. Low performance is enough. I personally charge my EV at home with a power line of 3.7 kilowatts, 16 amperes. I use only 10 amperes. That means one night, 100 kilometers of range with a power like a strong hairdryer. So we need these charging points. We need many of them at work and at the offices. And I think we could need, overall in Europe, more political help and support and regulation framework that buildings and garages are prepared for this. And I recommend an orientation towards benchmarks like Norway or the Netherlands. This could be helpful because we want to decarbonize the whole Europe. That means that we need electric cars everywhere. And looking at all these different charging modes, I would say we should not expect more electric cars in a city than charging points. So everyone can count in his home city. What's happening? Is it enough? It's not enough. It's up to ourselves to judge that and then to take influence. So, last chart. I concentrated a little bit on decarbonization in context of the powertrains and charging because I think this is the crucial success factor. But of course, decarbonization and mobility improvements will only work with a system approach, and which is the fuel for system approaches, of course, is digitalization, no doubt. And of course, we need a more fluent traffic management. We can use that data to do this on the infrastructure side, on the pavement side, if I may say that. Let's avoid bottlenecks. I think we have a chance to discuss about improved intelligent logistics. I think mobility services are essential everywhere in Europe, and they will decrease the number of needed cars in inner cities. That's okay. It's necessary. Decarbonized fuels, we work that they will be affordable. At the moment, they are not affordable and not industrialized in a necessary way. 5G as a basis for infrastructure in cities for connected and automation vehicles, and of course, a strong public transport. These are elements of a holistic approach to make mobility better and decarbonize our mobility. I would like to close with 2 wishes, because the challenges are so complex and there is so much to do. First wish, let's do the work together. Together means politics, NGOs, and industry. And the second wish is, let's work as Europeans and not fragmented country by country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Gerd. And please do come and join me in the comfortable seats. Thank you very much indeed for setting out that vision of the future and some of those key challenges. You gave us your 2 key wishes there. I will also be seeking those from our... Don't leave us. He's gone. He'll be back in a second. I will be seeking those wishes also from our other panelists later on in the discussion. So Gerd, touching there really on those central elements of the Commission's low-emission mobility strategy that was unveiled a couple of years ago, when he talked about the efficiency of the system, and you touched on issues such as traffic management, urban management, and so on, the speed of deployment of alternative energies, and that crucial question, as you see it, of the infrastructure. Without that, it cannot happen. And this, how do we accelerate the move towards zero-emission technologies? One crucial question for our panel, Gerd. You talked about a portfolio, a diverse portfolio of powertrains. One of my questions to the panel will be, is there a silver bullet? Do we need to focus on one or other? Or should we, as Henrik Hollerlei also talked about the other day, put the right conditions in place to support them and then let the market decide? And as you said, the consumer decides. Lots of questions for our discussion. Let me bring up the panel. I'm delighted to welcome on stage, and please do come up as I introduce you, Lena Eriksson, Director General of the Swedish Transport Administration, Trafikverket. A very warm welcome to you, Lena, and come and sit next to me. Clemens Fürst, who is spokesman of the Board of Rail Cargo Austria. Lena, you are here next to me. Thank you. Clemens Fürst, where is Clemens? Please, from the Board of Rail Cargo Austria. Great to have you with us as well, Clemens. Alan McKinnon, who is a professor at Kuna Logistics University. Welcome to you, Professor McKinnon. And last but not least, José Mendes, who is Deputy Environment Minister of Portugal. Deputy Minister, a very warm welcome. I have asked our panel not to make any opening statements. We're going to dive straight into the discussion. I have a few questions for them, and then, as I said earlier, I will come out to all of you, not just for your questions, but I'm also happy if you have a comment to make, as long as we keep it brief so we can get as many people involved as is possible. Lena, perhaps I could turn to you first. In terms of the challenges, Gert there outlined what he saw as the likely future development in terms of the portfolio of powertrains, on, of course, focusing there very much on the road sector. Broadly, how do you see the key challenges to get this decarbonised mobility system, and how would you assess how we're doing so far?
I would say that there is a challenge, is also an opportunity. So there's two sides of the coin. I think we need to focus on three things. Two of them already mentioned. We need vehicles that are much more energy efficient than today. And we see the electrification as a part of that, that could really contribute. So we are really looking forward into that. Of course, to shift to fossil-free fuels. We need to do that, and we need to do that in a much faster pace than we do today, of course. What I want to emphasize a little bit more is that we also need to look how the society in itself could be more transport efficient, which means that we also need to see much more of a shift to public transport, but also biking and walking. We need to look at, on the freight side, how the system in itself could be more efficient. We are looking very much into how we could introduce more of heavier and longer vehicles, both trucks, trains, and so on. How we could shift more to railways and waterways. How we could introduce platooning, for example. I think it is important to also look into the transport efficiency for the society, because that also contributes to other goals. Not only to get a more clean or contribute to decarbonisation, but also how could we create more of living cities, for example? How could we reduce the noise from the transport system? So we have to look at all this. And the digitalization could be a very important tool for that.
I was going to just quickly follow up, if I might, before we move on. Do you see that primarily, that more transport-efficient society, as primarily a technological challenge, a policy challenge, or a behavior, a mindset challenge?
I would say it's a combination, but if I have to choose, I think it's very important to have the policy measures in itself is important, because it could both give incentives for the introductions of new technology, but it's a kind of both push and pull. We need to both push and pull, especially if we're looking at we should achieve these goals in the Paris Agreement. So we can't just wait. There are technological challenges, but I'm more convinced that we will reach that, but it's definitely necessary. But also about behavior change. So it's a combination.
We'll come back on that, I hope, in our discussion. Clemens Voss, from your perspective, the key challenges, would you agree with what's been outlined? Is there something you would add to that? And how would you assess our progress so far in this area?
First of all, I do agree. I would just like to put the emphasis a bit more on the topic of intermodality. So coming out of a railway company, I obviously believe that rail is the key to decarbonisation, because we talk about electromobility. Rail is electromobile since decades, right? By the way, but it's not just the source of energy, it's also the energy efficiency. If you look about the specific energy need you need in rail cargo compared to road, you have in sort of rail mobility compared to road, it's typically a factor of 5. So you're 80% more energy efficient per ton kilometer, per passenger mileage, and so on in rail. So I think rail is important, and rail also has lots of other advantages towards, for example, road transport, be it the safety aspect, be it congestions, and so on. So obviously, we are also aware that rail is not suitable for all kinds of transports, and that's sort of where the intermodality aspect comes in, because coming out of passenger, you want to have a door-to-door transport in a convenient way, and you don't want to have a train station to train station transport. Same to cargo. So it's the combination of pushing rail in combination with intelligent and convenient intermodal traffic and mobility offers. So now if rail does have these obvious advantages, the question is, why is rail why does rail have so little relevance in Europe today? And if you look at the passenger market, modal share of rail is like in the region of 10%. And if you look at the freight market, modal share of rail is below 20% in Europe. The question, why is this? Yeah, and a couple of reasons which I'd be happy to touch on now and later is, obviously, we as railways, we have to do our homework. That's the first part. Second part, which is extremely important, and this also picks up on topics which have been discussed before, is what we call level playing field. Because apart from all behavioral topics or emotional topics, in the end, it often boils down to how much do you pay for a given service. Yeah? And again, we sort of judge this typically in a microeconomical viewpoint, so essentially the euros we spend. What is really important, and you've mentioned before the social cost and the environmental cost, but what is really important is the macroeconomic cost to Europe, to the society. And there are many examples for a huge part of transport need or mobility need where a microeconomic disadvantage of rail turns into a macroeconomic advantage if you include factors like safety, like CO2, like congestion time and so on. And I think in order to really have an optimized, in terms of sort of an economic or a European view, an optimized transport mix, you need to have this level playing field, so people need to understand what are the real costs of the modes you're using. The second part for rail, it's mainly for the cargo area where I'm coming from, is the whole topic of interoperability. Yeah. And essentially that's just a simple claim, running a train through Europe should be as easy as running a truck through Europe. We can maybe go on that in more detail. And the fourth topic is again something which is more towards us as railway companies and towards the industry, is the whole innovation part. And it's always a simple example is autonomous driving. Where would autonomous driving be the most simple? On rail, okay. Because the steering part is gone, and it's pretty shaming for us in the industry that the road sector is way further than we are. Okay, we'll come back on many of those issues, and this being the year of multimodality as declared by the Commissioner, and indeed it was said in the first panel, actually every year should be the year of multimodality. How do we really get there? You've identified some of the key issues. I also am wondering here whether we have focused a great deal in mobility packages and so on the road sector till now for obvious reasons, but nevertheless the Commissioner mentioned maritime the other day, and the agreement in the International Maritime Organization, a baby step, but a significant step nevertheless. Aviation, all these other elements of this decarbonised transport. Have we maybe focused too much on one thing in both senses? Alan McKinnon, from your perspective, the key challenge ahead?
I think for me the biggest challenge is getting the message across. I mean, I'm a logistics professor, so I'll be talking mainly with respect to freight transport, but getting the message across to managers and to politicians on two things. One is the urgency with which we have got to achieve very deep reductions in carbon emissions, and the second thing is the scale of those reductions. Just first of all, on the urgency, if one looks at the climate science community, these days they think in terms of carbon budgets, the accumulated amount of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, because that's what drives climate change. Regrettably, I think many people in the transport sector still think of the EU's target for a 60% reduction in emissions by 2050 against a 1990 baseline. And so they think it's just the annual emissions in that year have to drop by 60%. But it's not as simple as that. We have to minimize the total amount of transport-related emissions that goes into the atmosphere over the next 30 years. And that will require us to peak those emissions very soon and then drop very dramatically. And I don't think that message has got across as yet to many of the planners and managers. And then on the magnitude of those reductions, if we simply look at the freight sector, even if we were to hit the EU target by 2050, we would require a 6-fold reduction in the carbon intensity of freight transport in Europe between 2015 and 2050. Now, that is going to be almost impossible to achieve. I mean, if we throw everything at it, the technological development, switching mode, improving vehicle capacity, that's going to be a very tough challenge. So what we then have to suggest is that we're going to have to control demand. And this is where I would take issue with the Transport Commissioner. And I know it's a very provocative remark, but I think at some stage we have to look at some way of containing the growth, certainly in the demand for freight transport over that time period. Otherwise, I don't think we're going to meet the necessary reduction.
So the Commission's long-term mantra since 2011, curbing mobility is not an option. You're saying it has to be.
Well, if you think of the alternative, then we will have to reduce carbon intensity to such an extent, I just don't think that is possible.
We'll come back on that.
But maybe I'm unduly pessimistic. Okay?
Come back on that in our discussion and ask the extent to which these combinations of things, we talked about it earlier, the technology, the policy, all these things working together can deliver, or do we need to be more radical than we are so far? But Jose Mendes, complete the picture for us, will you? We talked a lot about the role of politicians in all of this. How do you see the challenge ahead? And do you think we need to be a little bit more revolutionary in our thinking to get there?
Well, that challenge is how are we going to face an increasing demand on mobility. You know, until 2050, it can be that between 1 and 2 billion people will move to urban areas, and they will adopt a mobility pattern similar to the ones we have. This means that the 7.5, 7.6 gigatons of CO2 emissions per year can double. So how are we going to face, you know, increasing demand on mobility and in the same time, you know, decrease the, reduce the emission, the CO2 emissions? Now, this is the big challenge. People like to say that the transport sector is off track when you look at, or if you want to deliver on the Paris Agreement targets. And we can fairly say that this is correct, but there is also good signs that we can change, revert this situation. And I would pick up the last words of Gerd when he says that we should talk as Europeans and all together. So the first challenge I would list is the ones that puts together countries, cities, and companies. The Paris Agreement was set up by countries. We shouldn't forget this. But the real actors, you know, the ones that will change reality on the fields are as well countries, but cities and companies. So to put them together, and Portugal, France, and the Netherlands have just launched the Transport Decarbonisation Alliance, and if we have the chance, I can talk about that later on. The second challenge would be, how can we allow for new mobility models that stand on sharing concepts? Current cities cannot cope with so many vehicles. So we have to find out how we can combine properly public transport, sharing mobility models, new models, and as well as active modes, so we can face this need for reducing the number of cars we have in our cities. The third challenge is, you know, energy and transport are typically treated separately. So how do we deploy, how do we design a strategy for low carbon energy deployment for the mobility system, for the transport system? And finally, as I come from a government, I belong to a government, I would remind that, you know, 6.5% of the fiscal revenues come from the fuel sector, let's say. So states will not want to give up of this revenue. So I think that we need new taxation models, because the taxation models we have in our days are the ones of, you know, previous technology, last century technology. We need new taxation models for this century's technologies.
Thank you. Could you just, before we move on, say 2 words about your alliance? This is a new alliance between you, France and the Netherlands.
Yeah, this is a new alliance that was launched by Portugal, the Netherlands, and France, together with Costa Rica. It includes as well, and the idea is to put together, you know, front runners, countries, companies, and cities. We have on board now Michelin, Alstom, and other companies. We will launch it in Leipzig next month in May, during the ITF summit. And the idea is that we can share good experience, good practices, and we can somehow advocate these goals so we can accelerate the mobility decarbonization process. Because, I mean, really, if things continue the way we are, I don't think we will be able to deliver on the Paris Agreement targets. And what is true is that, I mean, these targets are the ones we know. We know that we have these initiatives from the European Commission, for instance, but it's very, very important to put together, you know, to join cities and companies. For instance, I hear now very often cities announcing new ideas of, you know, diesel ban and so on inside cities, but I hear nothing about this from the car industry. I mean, how can you announce this if you don't know if that from the supply side, the industry can or cannot, you know, fulfill these targets? So this is the idea of putting together these three stakeholders, let's say, so we can accelerate decarbonization.
Thank you very much. Gert, a reaction to what you have heard in terms of to what extent we need to change track, do more, change our thinking in order to get there if we are to meet the goals. But also, can I ask you the same thing about the drivers? Whether you see them, the question I asked Lena earlier, as primarily technological, as primarily policy, or in terms of industry and deployment. What do you see as the key challenge here? You mentioned infrastructure as a specific challenge, but where are the drivers?
I think we have the toolbox available. We have to use the toolbox. Yeah. And I think a target setting from the political side is very important, challenging but achievable targets. And then we need pilot projects, big pilot projects for implementation. Then we learn what's working and what not. And as I say, all of us, we have to think big and act strongly.
Think big and act strong. Let me ask you, just coming down to some specifics, this question of the silver bullet or not silver bullet, and where we go. I was very struck. Henrik Hololai said, when he was talking the other day, we must strive to be as technologically neutral as possible. It's the market that is best to judge which way to go. And somebody said earlier, policy is about setting the goals. Tell us where we need to be, and let us, industry researchers, work out how we get there. Would you agree with that? And how can we support, for example, and accelerate the move towards zero-emission technologies and remain tech neutral at the same time? It's quite a difficult balancing act, isn't it? Any thoughts on that? Alan?
Maybe preface my remarks by saying it's not simply technology. I know in the freight world, it's guys at what I call the vehicle and fuel school who seem to think that they are the ones that are going to decarbonize freight. But we also have to factor into our calculations behavioral changes, operational changes as well, because I think only if we deploy all of these things will we achieve the really deep reductions in greenhouse gases. But if we just look at the technologies, I've just done a book on decarbonizing logistics, and so I've reviewed the research in this area, and it's complicated. Because you've got different technologies vying, if you like, to take the lead role in decarbonization. So if we focus on road freight, because road freight represents 50–60% of ton kilometers in Europe, so if we decarbonize that, we get a lot of leverage on the total carbon footprint of freight transport. Used to be, for long-haul road freight, we thought it would be biofuels that would solve the problem. We thought there's no way you can get battery-powered long-haul trucks. But then we did the life cycle analysis of biofuels, and we discovered that, in fact, the net greenhouse gas emissions are very small, if they even exist at all. And in the meantime, we've seen breakthroughs in battery technology. We've heard about the Tesla truck, and people are now thinking in terms of battery-powered long-haul trucks. Hydrogen, again, we dismissed in the past because of the huge energy loss in the hydrogen supply chain. But even that's being rehabilitated. And then, in the meantime, along has come the electrification of highways, which perhaps Lena will want to talk about in a bit more detail, which 5 or 6 years ago we thought was science fiction, but now has gained, excuse the metaphor, a lot of traction, and we're beginning to see pilot projects developing. But the problem is, looking forward to 2050, we're not quite sure what the technological roadmap is going to be and what the relative contribution will be between all of these different technologies. And you said, let the market decide, but it's not that simple, because a lot of these things require a lot of infrastructural investment, and therefore it's the politicians that make a judgment.
So that's the, hang on, wait, that's the problem. Briefly, what is the solution? How do we deal with that challenge? Because as you say, every time you think, we know what the big thing is, we know what the potential silver bullet is, we've been wrong so often.
Yep, okay, so we have to ramp up the research. We've got to do pilot projects increasingly to do this. We just got to get better at road mapping, it seems to me, and looking. I don't think it's any one of those things. Yeah. I mean, it's the old Al Gore thing. It's not a silver bullet we're looking for, it's silver buckshot. It's a whole collection of things. But it's working out the relative contribution that these technologies will make, and also how they can be coordinated and combined so that we can exploit synergies. I think that's the key.
This point about the intermodality. Lena, you wanted to come in, and then Clemens.
I agree. It's not a silver bullet, and in principle, you can say Mr. O'Leary is right. But I agree with Alain. It's not that easy. Of course, policy measures like new tax model will support different kinds of new technology. We see that very clear. If you support or give tax reduction for different kinds of fuel cells or for biofuel introduction and so on, that will have a huge impact of how many will choose that alternative, of course. So policy measures and the new technology is very much combined. And I agree that there are solutions where we can try to find this kind of win-win situation where we also could implement new technology. As Alain mentioned, we had our inauguration now for our second test site when it comes to electric roads. And I think that's a good example, so I want to mention it because that's a case where we had heading for a pre-commercial innovation process. So we described, this is the problem, and we need this kind of function. This is what we need to solve. And we want you, the market and the academia, together to come up with a solution. And we want you to compete with each other to see that. And we came up with two tests. One is Siemens Scania together with a pantograph, a little bit like what we use on the railway side. And we just had an introduction with based on conductive energy in the payment, embedded in the payment, a pickup solution where you reload the trucks. We will try something similar now on the railway side for a research program, more on commercial side. And I think we need to work more like that, in a agile process together, in a good cooperation between the industry, academia, and the public authorities. But at the same time, as they are now looking at what kind of aspects, what kind of objectives, what kind of problems will we face, we are also looking at what kind of business model will we use here? What kind of regulation do we need to change? What kind of how we get the energy company on board, etc.
And that brings us back to that competitiveness issue, time and again, which if we don't answer that question at the same time, we get nowhere. Clemens, you wanted to come in, and then Jose.
It was basically, in short words, my point. I don't think it's goals, which is silver bullet. I don't think it's technology, because if you really look how people make decisions, be it now companies in freight or be it people like all of us here making our mobility decisions, just ask yourself, I mean, price is definitely involved, strongly, and then comfort. And if we don't solve this, I don't believe in behavioral change, and I just believe the number of people who just do it for the greater good is just too small to really have a significant change. So if you now look at the cost aspect, and if you look at the convenience aspect, I think the cost aspect leads me back to the level playing field argument. You need to have cost transparency, and I don't care whether you tax road or you subsidize rail. It doesn't matter. It just needs to be sort of a fair cost comparison, and then I believe, and I think you quoted it before, the market will sort it out. The second part is convenience, right? I mean, if you look at cost of public means of transport, and if you look at cost of your own car, already now the car is more expensive if you really do a real calculation, and you include all the costs like insurance, depreciation, and so on, and not just the marginal costs. But then comes convenience. And now if you ask yourself, let's now not talk about cargo, but let's talk about passenger. If you want to go from your home to a city far away and then maybe to a destination which is not directly in the center of the city, it's just way more convenient to go in your car, to type the address in the navigation system, and then you're there. You don't have to worry about any kind of mobility, especially in your destination. So one part is the level playing field, which is policy. purely policy. The other part is then really the product offering, which is industry.
Which comes back to the point you made earlier about interoperability, because, for example, with rail, I know you're on the freight side, but I have tried as a passenger. I'd love to get a train across Europe. Totally impossible. Have to keep changing trains every time I reach a border. Looked at doing it, think, oh, I can't be bothered. Too complicated. So
make it even easier.
To
make it easier. Stay in Austria, but then try to get sort of the mobility at your destination to your final. To the final point
the
of
last
the destination.
mile.
From the last mile,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that's the issue, and I mean, there are trials. I mean, for all of us, at ÖBB, we are sort of experimenting. There's Wegfinder, it's German for Austria, which is an app, essentially, which combines different modes of transport for this intermodal solution. So you get different options, including car sharing, including taxi, including bike sharing. So
that very much has to be part of the picture.
And that's industry responsibility.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jose.
We all generally agree about long-term objectives. This is clear. Everybody knows that we have to decarbonize by 2050 and so on. The point is how many of us want to change behavior tomorrow, and this is what we have to do. That's why I think that we need quick wins. It's very important. Quick wins can initiate disruptive processes. For instance, the correlation between the expansion of the electric vehicle charging network in Portugal and the acquisition of electric vehicles is impressive. You know, this means that, and there is a market gap. That's why I'm spending public money in that. There is a market gap because the number of electric vehicles is not enough to deploy a large charging network. And on the other side, if you don't see the charging network, you don't buy an electric car.
The chicken and egg situation. Yeah.
And we are doing it. And it's, I would dare to say that by now, expanding electric vehicles charging network, it's a huge marketing task, and we have to do it. We have to do it as fast as possible, and I understand that public money is spent on that. At the same time, we need to deploy economic instruments, you know, fiscal incentives, and especially, and this is important for car makers, to de-risk investments for the future. For instance, shortening amortization periods and so on. So it's very important that people feel that from an economical and financial point of view, it is worth in the next, tomorrow, to start making a move.
Can I just ask very quickly, and then I want to come to Gerd, because Gerd raised this infrastructure, the charging infrastructure, as the central challenge as he saw it. If you're doing it and you have found a way to resolve that chicken and egg dilemma, why can't everyone? Is it just a question of committing the resources needed to do it, having the political will to do it? Why are others not doing as well as you are?
I mean, it's a matter of, you know, willingness, and it's a matter of investment. And there is an additional topic that is a technological topic. I mean, as we could see with one of the slides of Gerd, that battery electric vehicles still do not fulfill the needs when we want to travel between cities. And that's why I think that we should focus on expanding the electric vehicle charging infrastructure in cities. It answers to the city mobility demands.
Thank you. Gert, a reaction on that if you would, and I would also like to come to this question. Jose talked there about de-risking investments. You know, we need the financing to de-risk. When it comes to cutting-edge innovations in your sector, in the other sectors, other transport sectors, what do you think the key is? What sort of incentives really work?
I would like to stay at this topic just discussed by my colleague here. As I showed in my presentation, the auto industry is investing. These 25 models at BMW are real, not at the street, but we are working on them. They will be on the street. And also other companies announced what they want to do. So there is perfect transparency that there will be a huge number of models, PHEV and EVs. I explained why we need both on the market. So perhaps in the past there was a chicken egg problem. We all know in this room there will be plenty of offers, and we would like to sell these cars. So it's, I think, not only the task of the automotive industry now to set the framework and to convince investors to do something for charging. We invest as an automotive industry billions, many billions of euros in these cars. They, in our prototype plants, they are real, these cars. They are not here in this room, but they are real. So it's not for us as professionals It's not a chicken and egg problem. We know these cars will come. So I think there is not a big risk for politics, for energy suppliers to do a lot more for charging these cars. And of course, we are technologically neutral also in the new car. So it's about which technology exactly in batteries, which technology exactly in plug-in hybrids. But the general direction for the next 10 years is crystal clear in the car sector, and I think also in the truck sector. PHEVs, electric vehicles and combustion engines combined with 48 volt, so as mild hybrids. These are main directions. So it's very clear, so we shouldn't say we have only chicken and egg problems and we don't know what to do.
Okay, quick one if you would, Jose.
Just a quick one. Some of the car makers association complain about the too intensive focus on battery electric cars and plug-in. And they claim that targets should be agnostic regarding the type of technology. Yeah. And for instance, I agree with what Gerd just has said, but if you want to invest on hydrogen, for instance, there is still risk. And I think that we have to open options and to de-risk this sort of investment.
Alan, I think you wanted to come in. And then I'm coming out to all of you shortly.
Yeah, it's the issue of behavior, which has been discussed by several of the panelists. And people tend to think of that as consumer behavior, because in the automotive sector, they are your consumers. But in the logistics world, we've got to rethink that whole concept of behavior, because there's a chain of behavior. You know, the people are buying the goods in the shops, and then the retailers, and then the manufacturers, and then they outsource their logistics to the logistics providers, and they're the ones then who buy the trucks and the vehicles and use the services of the railway companies. And what we need is a chain of behavioral response there. One thing that worries me at the front end, because we are so good in logistics at delivering things very quickly and efficiently. To some extent, logistics is currently supporting unsustainable consumption. You know, people ordering goods online in the evening and expect them delivered the next morning for no cost. Or people buying 6 dresses and returning 5 of them. You know, that is unsustainable. And to my mind, that is a transport issue as well. But further back along the chain, a lot of the logistics providers I talk to say that they do not sense that their clients, the manufacturers and the retailers, are interested in decarbonisation. That it's not a high-rated...
From a business perspective, in terms of, we've talked about some of the issues here, energy efficiency, for example, and you know, it's good for you economically as well as playing your part in contributing to this movement. So why not? It should make business sense to do it.
Well, it does, yeah. I mean, I often say that we're currently in the low-hanging fruit era of transport decarbonisation, when most of the things we'll do to save carbon will actually save you money, right? And they'll give you a fairly quick payback, right? Regrettably, if you do the modelling, even once we've harvested all that low-hanging fruit, it will not take us to the very deep reductions in greenhouse gases that will be required. You know, so I don't know, maybe 5, 10, 15 years from now, we will start to do, we'll have to do the more painful things. We'll have to sacrifice probably some economic growth and investment return. But at least for the time being, we can get ourselves onto that trajectory, hopefully, by exploiting these green gold measures.
But if this is the low-hanging fruit era and we're struggling already, what does that say about that next stage? Lena, Clemens, then I'm coming out to all of you.
There will be effort in this, for sure, and problems, but there also will be win-win situations. So I agree, let's look at what kind of win-win situation do we have to push the development in the right direction. And what I would also like to take an example, what just mentioned here. We have in Sweden a cooperation, a horizontal cooperation between a steel company called SSAB, a minor company, and actually Scania. They try to see their logistics system and try to see how can we use each other's logistics system. And they come up with a train solution. So they will use the train solution for the return transport. And what they have achieved is that they have reduced the cost and reduced the CO2 emission. So it's a win-win situation. And then you can think, why on earth haven't they done this before? And what they say, it's we need to cooperate. Our logistics person need to cooperate with each other. That's an effort in itself. It's not that easy all the time. There are no third parties that actually support us in this. Because when we are turning to there, we have find the different transport mode. They contribute their solution, but nothing together. So we need to see other kinds. So this is more thinking outside the box. But there are solutions that could be a win-win. As you said, if you reduce the energy consumption, of course that's a win-win situation in the end of your figures. So that's a good thing. And you can do this, reduce the CO2 emission. So we need to see more of this.
And just briefly, you talked right at the beginning about push and pull factors. Is it carrots and sticks? Do we need a mixture of both? So the push, if you like, as well as the pull. How do you see that balance?
Yes, I think there's a need of both push and pull. But you can't own. I think it's important that you also have some kind of pull, some kind of carrots. Otherwise, you don't get any acceptance for it. So that's extremely important to have an acceptance to change the behavior, but also get an acceptance for people.
Otherwise, if you don't have the buy-in,
but
it won't
you need
work.
a push as well.
Okay, quick one, Clemens, if you would, and then I'm going out to the room. Grab you.
I just want to say I'm a bit less optimistic from my experience on the extent of the low-hanging fruit time, because yes, these examples exist, and yes, these examples have very much to do with the convenience aspect, and do you really have business models or products which make it convenient to have the typically more complex solutions that are decarbonized, because you need charging stations, you need intermodality and so on. It's really about business models where digitalization helps us and will help us, but which are not yet widely available, neither in passenger nor in cargo.
Thank you very much. Let me come out to all of you if you have a question, or as I say, I'm perfectly happy, as long as it's brief, to take a comment. Does anybody want to join in our discussion at this stage? Yes, I see one here. Can I ask you please to introduce yourself, and please stand up and please be brief. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
I'm Sergio Barberino, the chair of ALICE, the Logistic Technology Platform. I wanted to build on what Alan said. If we need to do demand-shaping interventions, and what Violetta said the other day, we don't want to do it. Is it possible to do it in a way that is irresistible, attractive for people and consumers, rather than making coercive? I mean, think about virtual reality and technology. Maybe next year at the TRA, half of us will be here as holograms, and then we don't need to travel. And because if we try to force it on people, I think it's not going to happen. But I think we also need to think about, do we really need all this transportation? Do we need to buy 6 dresses and return 5? Can we really do demand shaping? We did a study together with Alan. E-commerce can decarbonize shopping by a factor of 20 if it is well organized. And the question is to Alan, how optimistic you are that this can happen? And I have a question from BMW. You plan all these beautiful vehicles. Are you going to still sell the vehicles, or are you shifting to selling transport and mobility services?
Thank you very much. And we're going to hear from you tomorrow in our last plenary. I see one. I'm going to take a group in the interest of using the time most efficiently. Thank you very much, sir.
My name is Gerd Sammer from the Institute of Transport Studies in Vienna. And I have 2 questions. One is to Mr. Schuster from BMW. Please, can you make an estimation for 2030? How many electric vehicles will be on the road in Europe? What do you think? That's one question. The second is, most of you have said that one of the key issues is to internalize the external costs. For me, the main question is, how can we convince the politicians to go ahead to this goal? At least we must say internalization of external cost means that fuel prices would perhaps double or more. We must be aware of that.
Thank you very much indeed. And there's 1, 2 over this end. So 3, 4. Okay, short ones if you would. I'll try and squeeze everybody in. Thank you very much.
Sophie Punter from Smart Freight Center. My question is to both Alan McKinnon and the gentleman from BMW. If business are going to have to take a lead role in doing this, and there's not enough, especially for shippers or the customers of freight to do, or even the providers of trucking to do this, what do they need, in your eyes, from policy to get the right incentives for them to move faster? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. One here. Thank you very much, sir.
I'm Rod Franklin, also from CUNA Logistics University, so I'm an associate of Alan's. Alan knows that I am probably even more pessimistic than he is about this whole process. I'm just wondering if we're using linear models to look into the future. Do we really think that tomorrow's young people will be incented to buy cars that sit around for 95% of their useful life? Or will they be looking at mobility as a service? And if they do switch to mobility as a service, as many people are thinking, will we have the same problems? Do we need to be thinking about something different?
Which goes also back to that question about how BMW sees the future in terms of selling vehicles or selling services. Right at the back here. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the panel discussion. Chris Fennell from TML Policy Research. I sense a huge discrepancy between the thinking big and acting strong. In the whole panel discussion, not once we have discussed about the policy proposal from the Commission on the CO2 emission reduction targets of passenger cars. Two-thirds of CO2 transport emissions are covered by this legislation. Now, the proposal is minus 30% in 2030. This is already proven not enough to match, to come with the Paris agreements. And it's it's still being within, according to the own impact assessment of the Commission, a positive effect. So it's not even hurting. So this target should be much stronger. So what's the panel position on this target, the 30%? Should it be stronger?
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, I'll come into the middle here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maurizio Maggiore, European Commission. A couple of points. One is about the study on the user concerns. Were the users informed of the latest? Because the conclusion looks like to me, my experience is that a lot of people are not aware that recently we have vehicles with 400 kilometers at an affordable cost, for instance. And therefore, I think marketing and customer information is an important part of the story if we want to sell them. And the other point is, what is in zero emission as non-technology neutral? This is a performance target. So it's, according to me, in the definition of technology neutrality. And particularly for pollution, and we know how much cities are concerned with that, I think that has to be considered.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to come back on those unless there is another burning question, because I need to give the panelists, obviously, time to answer. OK, we have two more. They're waving their hands furiously. So let's take those, and then I'll come back to our panel. So come here, and then I'm coming to you, sir. Nice and close together so we save time.
Hello, my name is Isabel Mendes-Lopes, and I work for the infrastructure, the Road and Rail Infrastructure Manager in Portugal, Infraestruturas Portugal. And it's just a little comment on the first comment that was made. So we are speaking about mobility and transport, but we should be thinking also about the demand shift. And that means looking at all the trends that are changing the whole society. And so that's important. So we could be thinking about, for instance, how schools will evolve and how that will affect mobility and how that will contribute for the reduction in the carbon
Thank you very much indeed. So that point about we talk about approaching this holistically, but maybe we're not looking at the whole picture clearly enough. Last one for now. Thank you.
Hello, Nick Delmer, representing the shippers, so the users of freight transport. Earlier this week, I saw an article in which it was said that someone in the UK found a cheaper way to get transported. He bought himself a second-hand car in order, instead of buying a train ticket. I hope it's just an anecdote, but that was really in the newspaper. But that's not what I wanted to say. So you can see from my hair that I go already a long way. About 30 years ago, there was this wonderful idea of car sharing or car pooling. Not really successful, then it's in its second generation. 10 years ago, it was about cargo pooling. Not really successful. Multimodality, we've been discussing this earlier this week. So if this goes on the same way, we would only be left with the technology shift. So what would that bring us then? And wouldn't it be better to focus more on the mental shift rather than on the technology shift?
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to come back to the panel now because lots of points to address with them. Gert, there were a couple that were very specifically to you about in terms of your business model and will you in the future, do you envisage selling vehicles or more selling mobility services? And there was a very specific question about your estimate for the number of electric vehicles in 2030. But please pick up on other points if you want to, but those were very specifically to you.
We will deliver both mobility as a service and cars for private use, and we are prepared to act and also react. So it depends on the city, it depends on the wishes of the customers. I think car sharing and car pooling will be important to avoid congestion, and other services will be very important. We are prepared to make business with that, and also the wish for a private car will still be, in a large scale, still be stable in the next 10 years. So we are prepared for each of these possibilities. Looking at the number of, or predicting the number of PHEVs and EVs in 2030, I cannot truly exactly predict that because it's about the balance between a political framework, some incentives. The offer will be there from the car side. Electric vehicles are fun to drive, they are quiet, very good dynamics, so there will be no reason for customers not to buy them if the charging issue is solved. So I can only say that from the industrial point of view, a quick industrial means 10 years, 15 years, a very strong shift towards PHEVs and EVs, fuel cell vehicles perhaps later, can be done. And the better the framework is, and also the better was a good contribution, the support from the mindset is. We are our role models. The question is, do we drive these EVs or do we not drive these EVs? We as role models in politics and in industry. So we can do a lot that there will be a high number of EVs and PHEVs on the street in 2030. But please, I cannot really tell you how many.
And then you mentioned incentives. There was that question about what do you need from policymakers, politicians. You highlighted one issue where you need their support and said, we can't do this, but what else do you need from them in terms of those incentives?
I think to be very basic in my wish, I need the enforcement that charging has to be provided.
Okay, so that is the central focus. There were a number of other questions, demand shaping, so on. Can we, Alan first?
If I cherry pick the logistics-related questions, I mean, starting with Sergio about wondering what we can do to motivate consumers, maybe to change those consumption patterns. I mean, you say, Sergio, I mean, the research has been done to show that if we use online retailing and home delivery correctly, it can help to decarbonize. You know, as soon as you take a car-based shopping trip out of the equation, you get a significant reduction in CO2 emissions. In fact, I think Amazon on their corporate page still refers to some of the research we did 10 years ago, saying that this is empirical evidence that online retailing is good for the planet. But I think the price mechanism is really what will have to drive that people have to be made aware of exactly what it costs in terms of emissions and energy to get, you know, small deliveries. I'm terrified by the potential use of the Internet of Things and the Amazon Dash button for people to get instant replenishment of individual products. I mean, I think that'd be ghastly and very damaging for the environment. The thing I don't think we need to do is to put carbon labels on products, as some people are suggesting. I think we do need more carbon transparency at the front end so people are aware of the carbon impacts of their consumption behavior, but not to the level of putting carbon labels on products. Point made by Sophie about how we encourage the shippers to demand logistics services which are lower carbon and greener. I mean, there are some good news stories there. Indeed, Sophie's own organization, the Smart Freight Center, has identified leaders, large corporations that are behaving in a way which is reducing carbon emissions. It's just that we have to extend those good practices across industry as a whole. There's a long tail of companies which I think as yet are not fully motivated to do this.
And is that about awareness, knowing the latest information about affordability and so on? Is that?
I think it's partly awareness. I think it's partly exhortation as well. I mean, worldwide there's been a proliferation of green freight schemes in recent years to give companies education, if you like, and encouragement to do this. But at the end of the day, many companies are driven by short-term commercial priorities and share prices, and that's perfectly understandable. But my hope would be that through time, that the need, the imperative to decarbonize will rise up the corporate agenda.
Sure. Clemens, a comment on that if you would, but also on this broader question about if business, if industries like yours are to take the lead role, what do you need from the policymakers, from Jose and from Lena?
I mean, even at the risk of repeating myself, but I always start from the customer, and now I stay in the logistics area, but it's pretty much the same. Yes, we have really good discussion with industries like the FMCGs, like the automotive industries, which are tremendously interested in low carbon transport. Until you talk about the price tag. Yeah? And then it typically gets very difficult because, as you said, I mean, the procurement guys have their yearly budgets and there's a share price or there are investors and so on. And ultimately, that makes up a huge portion, maybe not 100%, but I mean, at least 80–90% of the decision boils down to price. And if you then again compare what I've said before, yes, the microeconomic consideration, in a microeconomic consideration, really the simple solution, the road solution, the diesel solution is in many cases still cheaper. Yeah? And as long as you don't change that from a microeconomic perspective to a macroeconomic perspective, I don't believe you will get a huge change in behavior. So, and whether this now, and the question has been asked, should we now tax or force, if you really make the sort of the comparison between rail and road, should we force road to internalize more of its cost, or should we sort of subsidize rail or have rail pay for less of its external cost? It doesn't really matter because for the society, it's a zero-sum game. But I think that's the key component to really have cost transparency, to really get the right decisions. And therefore, I also don't believe really very much in goals. I mean, it doesn't really matter what the EU Commission says it wants in 2030 or what it wants in 2050, as long as decisions are not influenced, and I would say at least 80% in cargo, maybe a bit less in passengers cost. The second part, again, is convenience. Typically, currently, you have cheap solutions, you have simple solutions. Yeah? If you want to go to another approach, it typically, even if it gets cheaper or the same price, it typically doesn't get simpler, and therefore you need the simple products, also that you've mentioned before, that need to be introduced in industry.
Jose, there was a question about convincing politicians and suggestions, look, we need to double fuel prices. There was also a question about the new reduction targets and do they need to be much stronger? That will, of course, be something for member states to argue over. And what is your reaction on both those questions? But please pick up on other points as well.
Yeah, on that, of course, that topic is under discussion in the European Union. I do believe that the targets are not enoughly ambitious. But this doesn't mean that we have to increase the reduction targets. I think 30%, some people talk about 40%, the industry talks about 20% reduction by 2030. I think that, first of all, the new reference calculation model should be taken into account because it induces an extra 5% of reduction in the reduction target. This should be taken into account. The second topic is that, yes, I believe that an intermediate target for 2025 is too soon, and I think we should carefully listen to industry about that. I mean, I think that it makes no sense to start immediately to apply fines to the car industry by 2025, because it's really a short time, and we know that the research and development cycles to change powertrains take time, and we should look at that. But one thing is true, I mean, we really have to be ambitious, and maybe we could work with the industry on the right blending, the right combination of different types of technology in order to achieve the objectives for 2030, instead of just saying, listen, you have to do this, and then if not, we will apply fines. Let me just come back to a question about if the youngsters would drop car ownership, and if they would adopt carpooling, car sharing, or whatever, mobility as a service models. I mean, it's quite evident, there are enough evidences in our days that youngsters would prefer to have a top smartphone than to have a car. But this doesn't mean they don't like cars and they don't want to drive in cars. This means that they don't have to own the cars.
Yeah.
This is the main topic. So this means that car makers, car industry should maybe move to mobility providers. And there is, let me just finish with this. I mean, governments can induce process of alignment between the individual behavior and the public interest. And the smart road charging is a good instrument for that. And this will have to be introduced in the near future for sure.
Okay. Lena.
I would also like to pick up some of the questions up there, but I will start to say that our starting point is quite good. I'm a little bit more optimistic than some of the others from the panelists here, because I think if you look at the transport system today, it's inefficient. It's not sustainable. We need to increase the traffic safety. We need to have need it more decarbonized, but we can also use it in a much more efficient way. And there are tools there, for sure. We are seeing new technology solution. We see new kind of fossil-free fuels. We see new business solutions. And the digitalization in itself will also be a tool. I'm sure we will see more of mobility as a service, both for passengers as well for freight transports. We will see more of shared economy. So I think it's important that we not only focus on the industry side and also looking at what happened in the society, what kind of business model we see. I agree with some of saying that we need to have also more of a look at what are we doing to get a more sustainable society in itself. How could we combine the transport system with special planning, for example, housing, schools, etc. So we need to work together with other sectors. We need to see what we can learn from the telecom, for example. So there's a lot of things happen, but it will not happen by itself. So there is a need also of this kind of policy measures to, as I said before, push and pull to get it in the right direction. But there are a lot of opportunities, and the system in itself could be much more efficient, which is a good starting point, I would say.
Okay. I just want to come to the question of future research and innovation funding. We've talked quite a lot about the regulatory framework, some of the policy drivers, but in terms of the successor to Horizon 2020, FP9, what, for each of you, do you think the key, I mean, the difficulty with this, we're talking about a holistic approach with so many different facets. So when it comes to looking at where we need to put the research funding, where it will add most value and deliver most bang for bucks, as it were, where would you put the focus for the future? Gert, what do you think the key gaps are where EU money can really make a difference?
It's a difficult question for me. I cannot answer it shortly. I think we should take into account what the recommendations of UCOR and AirTrack are. These are differentiated recommendations, and that's what I only can say. Okay. It's not a silver bullet. Yeah.
Jose, where would you put the emphasis? The battle royal will begin as soon as we have the publication of the numbers between different sectors, but also within the transport sector. Where do you think the focus needs to be?
I mean, if we look at the Horizon 2020 priorities, we can see there is one for clean and safe energy, and another one for green and integrated mobility. I think it's time to put them together and to design and to fund the development of solutions of energy deployment for transportation.
So
We shouldn't forget that transport is mostly the first or second end user of energy.
So it is that combining of the two worlds that for you, we aren't getting right, and where we have some research challenges that need to be met.
Yeah, the communities that work on energy and the ones that work on transportation are different communities. Somehow they have to mingle.
Okay. Alan.
A subject close to my heart as an academic, obviously. I've also been in the Transport Advisory Group for Horizon 2020 for the past 6 years. I chaired it for 2 years, so we've debated these issues long and hard. I think we have to recognize that the Commission has already funded a lot of decarbonisation-related research, and we should avoid simply duplicating a lot of the work that's been done. I think we should be trying to maximize the impact of much of the work that's been done already, to ensure implementation and commercialization and so forth. If you ask me what I think might be hot topics in the next round, I'll flag up a few. One thing we've not discussed at all is the relationship between climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. We've been talking here about cutting emissions. But certainly as far as logistics is concerned, climate proofing our built environment, reducing the exposure of our transport infrastructure to extreme weather is going to involve the movement of a lot of materials. So there's an important interrelationship here between mitigation and adaptation in the transport sector, which I don't think has been properly investigated. And the second thing is life cycle analysis, because a lot of the data that we currently use to measure the carbon intensity of transport activities it simply relates to the direct emissions from the vehicle. We really need to take a more holistic view of all of this, to look at all the infrastructure-related emissions, the administrative IT-related emissions, because it's only once we get that comprehensive view that companies and governments can make sensible decisions. And then my final hot topic, again, we've talked about technologies within the transport sector, but the transport sector is going to be impacted by a lot of technology that happens outside the boundary of transport. And just to flag up one, 3D printing. Now, initially I was very skeptical about the effects of 3D printing on the demand for freight transport, but now it's moving from a sort of batch size of one type of production to a mass production form, and I think potentially that could be a real game changer. It could reduce the amount of freight that needs to be moved in the future, it could relocalize production, and it'd be nice to get a handle on just the longer term impact of that technology on the transport system.
Okay, thank you. Clemens, for you, the focus for FP9, where do you think it should be?
Well, first of all, I'm usually skeptical of the return on investment of lots of this research funding. I would always fund towards business models and towards products. Because in the end, you need something the consumer accepts. You don't really need the basic research, because I think on the technology side, we have lots of the stuff we need. We also have all the IT infrastructure we need. We need products that are accepted, that are easy to use in the marketplace.
Okay, Lena.
I think it's important to move more into implementation now, because if I look what happened the last 20 years, the thing we saw on the research table is more on test sites, and the next step will be how could we implement it. So I think it's fair to say that we need also to look more. I think it's important to still keep up with the test sites and living labs and see, but also supporting the member states to implement this. Yeah. And I think it's not only looking at products and so on. I strongly believe in this kind of triple helix solution where the public authority, the industry, and the academia work together. But I think it is need to also support us. How could we implement it? What kind of standard regulation is needed, for example? What kind of business model is the best to introduce this? Recharging, for example. So there are other things also to take into consideration. So maybe more of a focus that we see if we are serious about this goal, about climate change. And my government has said that you need to reduce the CO2 emission from the transport system by 70% to 2030, fossil-free from 2045. It's a real challenge. We need to speed up, and that's why it's so important to also support, I think, the member states to introduce this kind of new technology.
Thank you. We are nearly out of time. We focused there on the research needs for the future, but more broadly now, and let me put you on the spot, and I'll start, do this in reverse order to how we started. So Jose, I'll come to you first, come down the line to Lena, and then to Gert last. Gert talked to us at the beginning about, at the end of his presentation, his 2 wishes. I want to ask each of you if you have a wish, something you really want, and it can be from anyone. You can want it from yourselves as politicians and policymakers, in your case, Jose, or from industry. It can be from researchers, whoever you like. One wish and one priority for action to deliver on that wish. Jose first.
Well, I think the number of vehicles in increasing number of cities is becoming unmanageable. You know, it's too many externalities together: road safety, emissions, air pollution, congestion, and so on. So I think it's quite critical, urgent even, to reduce the number of vehicles. For this, I would, and I'm trying to do this in Portugal, create the conditions for carpooling, car sharing, new models, new business models, and van pooling and van sharing, because this is something in between public transportation and private or individual transportation. So somehow we have to match, to have a real-time matching of supply and demand. We have to drive if and when we need. And together with this, of course, we have to expand the electric vehicles charging network, because this is marketing for the future.
Thank you very much. Alan.
Yeah, a point that a few of the panelists have mentioned, including Lena, collaboration. Within the logistics world, I think there's a recognition that if we're going to achieve these really deep reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, it's not something that companies can do on their own. They have to share their logistics assets increasingly. Unfortunately, we've had about 30 years of discussion on supply chain collaboration, and it still has not happened to any great extent. But if somebody could wave a magic wand so that companies suddenly realize that they have to do this collectively, I think that would make a big difference.
Thank you. Clemens.
2 wishes. First of all, level playing field. Let me just give you 1 point of data. Modal share of rail in Europe is 17%. Austria is sort of investing in an EU-notified subsidy scheme of 80 million euros. Modal share in Austria is 30%. So have level playing field in Europe. First thing. Second thing is then a wish towards ourselves to use everything we got from technology to digitalization to really create multimodal offerings which are convenient to use and which are accepted in the marketplace.
Thank you very much. Lena?
Collaboration. I think the cooperation between public authorities, the industry, and academia could be even more successful if we really work together, and including the users, so get all the stakeholders on board. A wish, I hope we could be as successful with this as we have been when it comes to traffic safety. Because I think we have, if we're looking at it, we have been very successful how we have been able to reduce the number of fatal accidents with a zero vision, with a clear target, introducing more safe technology in our cars, for example, the vehicles, safer infrastructure, and change the behavior of the user. So I think we could do the same when it comes to decarbonization, but we need to keep together.
Thank you very much. They're singing from the same hymn sheet. Gert, you told us your wishes. Anything you'd like to add by way of closing?
I already told about my wishes. I would like to add a close collaboration with politics and understanding that all of us have to speed up.
So speed is of the essence. Don't underestimate the urgency. Get that message across. Ladies and gentlemen, will you join me in thanking our panel very much indeed? And thank you, Gert, for your presentation. And thank you to all of you for your questions and your comments. All of these issues will be delved into much more detail in the strategic sessions that follow. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.